All right, now we have to get back into part two of the video on sword eras versus historical periods because I was interrupted by one of my son's friends coming over. I don't know what they do. No, they're fine. So again, I, when it comes to historical periods, if it's really old, I'm only trusting NBTHK or NTHK papers. Preferably the newer yellow papers, not the older green papers. I've heard that the older green papers can be somewhat suspect, but I don't know. Use your personal judgment. At least some papers are better than no papers, usually. So the Kamakura period, again, was 1185 to 1333. To find a blade that old, that's in collectible condition, that you're going to get for a deal anywhere, let alone on eBay, would be exceedingly rare. So take that with a grain of salt. Next period, Nambokucho period, 1336 to 1392. Again, if you're going to find a blade that's that old, that's in good enough condition where it's collectible, restorable, or that you're willing to pay a few grand to have a polisher fix and have as a prized possession, if you're going to find that on eBay or even a website for a deal, take anything you see or hear with a grain of salt. Muromachi period, more likely. Muromachi going forward. Muromachi period, late 1300s to about 1573. Edo period, about 1573, 1600 to 1867. Most of the blades you're going to find for sale on eBay that are going to be collectible for your average person, and you're going to be able to get a deal, or even on a website, collectible for the average person, you're going to get a deal, are going to be Edo period. It's a newer period. There wasn't a lot of fighting during this period. There was, of course, the major battle of Sekigahara in 1600. After that, the siege of Osaka Castle. But aside from those two events in the early 1600s, there wasn't really a lot of fighting. So the blades were made for samurai to have and wear. A lot of them became higher, lower, middle, lower level administrators, and the blades weren't really used a lot. But they were well preserved because they were still valued possessions and a lot of money. So those are the blades and swords you're going to find that are going to be in decent shape. So, and I wrote myself a little note here, expected condition of blades. Where you can really find blades from those earlier eras that are in really good condition. Again, it's going to be more like reputable websites. AOIart.com, AOIart.com. Though it's a seller from Japan, but the descriptions are in English too. That helps. Yeah, there are blades on there where you could find from these earlier periods, but the prices are commensurate with the condition and the age. So just bear that in mind. So the chances of you finding a huge steal on anything from the Kamakura and Nambokucho period on eBay, not so much. So that's pretty much the end of this. Oh wait, one more thing. Sorry, going back to the samurai sword designation. Before Hideyoshi's sword hunt in the late 1500s, Hideyoshi was one of the guys who tried to unify Japan. Or did pretty much. Not as far as Tokugawa Ieyasu went, but he came before Tokugawa Ieyasu. Hideyoshi went on a sword hunt in the late 1500s. That means he wanted more control over Japan. And not a political statement here, but if you want to get control over entire society and people, disarming them is one of the steps to doing that. It's far easier to have control over a populace when they're not armed. Before that, though, it wasn't just samurai who had swords. And even after that, it wasn't just samurai who had swords. Although the longer swords could be owned by farmers, artisans, other groups of people other than samurai before the late 1500s, before Hideyoshi's sword hunt. So just because you have an older blade that was, especially one that made before like the late 1500s, that it doesn't mean it was necessarily owned for most of its history by a samurai. Could have been owned by a farmer, could have been owned by a merchant. So bear that in mind. In the later period, more likely that it was owned by a samurai, but if it was a long blade. But shorter blades, especially those like I said, under 24 inches, were allowed to be owned by farmers, although they were less likely to be able to afford it. More like merchants, especially wealthy merchants. Some of the really elaborate fittings, mounts, and blades that you see, especially if they're under 24 inches, were probably not owned by samurai. They were owned by merchants. Most of the samurai, especially in the Edo period, were not wealthy. There were very few of them were actually wealthy. Most were just scrimping and saving to get by. It was a hard existence for a lot of people in Japan at that time. Yes, even samurai. So that's another thing to bear in mind. So that being said, I'm planning on making more videos about related topics in the future, and I'll bring in more examples, and we'll see more then. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.